Welcome, everybody. Today is the 12th of May, Wednesday, 2021, and this is the Cluster API project meeting. Cluster API is a SIG Kubernetes project, and we're following their community guidelines in this meeting. So please treat others as you would expect to be treated, and raise your hand if you'd like to talk, and I'll call on you. So this meeting is kind of light on PSAs. There's nothing there. So I guess we'll just move right into the discussion topics, which conveniently I have the first one. So I don't know if everyone here is familiar with KubeMark, but KubeMark is a like testing application, or not a testing application, but it's like a Kubernetes hollow server or hollow node server that you can use to do testing with. And several months ago, Ben Moss started a KubeMark provider that would essentially use Cluster API to deploy these KubeMark nodes. And a KubeMark node, it will pretty much just accept any operation. So it's not really great for testing deep integration, but there is a level of testing that it is good for. So recently I've been updating that provider and trying to think about some future work that I wanted to do there, mainly in terms of integrating it with autoscaler testing that I'm looking at. And when I brought this up, Fabrizio had mentioned that he was doing some work to create a hollow node KubeMark type interface for the CapD provider that we have. So I think, there's a lot of overlap between these areas, and I just wanted to kind of bring the conversation up here because I'm curious if there's a way we could kind of increase the collaboration, or maybe, maybe we don't need both KubeMark implementations. So yeah, I wanted to kind of bring it to the group, and really, I guess, Fabrizio and I were talking about this, so I'd be curious to hear Fabrizio's thoughts, about like, should we keep both or what?
Yeah, I answer this. So first of all, I totally agree that this could be useful, and I'm even doubling down, because I think that this is useful not only for autoscaler, but it could be useful for CAPI end-to-end, because I want to start stress testing CAPI. And it could be useful for developer experience, because whenever developer want to develop locally, and it basically does not need to run the workload on the worker nodes, all the pod gives an alternative which is super fast and lightweight. So that definitely +1 for the idea from my side. I don't have stronger preferences on the provider, to be honest. Yeah, the provider the report was opened, but being not active, I just forgot that it was there. And so I don't have strong opinion about where we want to host this, but I'm kind of figuring out some requirement that we should, let me say, address, no matter where we keep the code. So definitely there are overlap. I don't want to keep the same code in 2 parts. We will choose one. So the kind of requirement that I have in mind is one. The first one is that if you want to rely on this provider for CAPI end-to-end test, that means that we have to assume and be sure that this KubeMark implementation, for machine KubeMark implementation, is well maintained and also up to date with Cluster API master. Otherwise, our end-to-end we run into problem. So point number 1 is that we have to be sure to being able to keep up with maintenance and the project changes. Second is just let me say a minutia, but let's keep also this in mind, is that if it is a separated provider, it is a little bit more complex to set up our tests, because we have to install 2 provider, we have to pull in an external repo, stuff like that, an external image should be built. It's not a big problem, but it is something that we have to keep in mind if we keep a separate provider. And the last point, which is really important for me, and also, in my opinion, total a kind of a requirement is that we have to get people from SIG scalability on board. Otherwise, there is the risk that we are not following the KubeMark changes. And this is tomorrow. I'm going to SIG scalability and basically present the idea or try to get them on board an idea. So first of all, this will help to solve initial problem because now the provider kind of works, but there are some flakes, which is not ideal. And second, but not really my top priority, but a great opportunity is that it will be super great if we can get SIG scalability to use cluster API for their own test. This will be a huge achievement, and yeah, let's see tomorrow how it works. And my idea is that we can, now I'm kind of experimenting, and we can postpone the final decision to where to keep this code when the experiment is finished. But I don't have strong preferences.
Okay, thanks a lot, Fabrizio. That was a great explanation and some great points there. I mean, I tend to agree with you on a lot of what you're saying, and I think Vince has given a +1 to keeping it in tree. Like, I think it makes a lot of sense to keep it in the CapD stuff. For all the reasons that you mentioned, on the scalability stuff, like I'm also interested in seeing the SIG auto scaling use cluster API for one of the testing paths there as well. So I think, there's a lot of extended testing that we could do with something like this. One of the things that I was wondering while looking through the KubeMark provider itself, because I think at this point for me, the main difference seems to be like if we put the hollow node stuff in with CapD, it's pretty much tied to the CapD implementation, whereas the KubeMark provider by itself seems a little more flexible to deploy onto pretty much any cluster that you could create with CAPI. So I don't know that anyone would use that because I don't know that you would create like a GCP node to run KubeMark on or something. But one of the things I was wondering was, is there a way for us to encapsulate the KubeMark logic inside of cluster API in such a way that, like, if we wanted to keep the provider around, we could actually just use like a library coming out of, the main repo or something. So that was kind of, maybe that'd be a way for us to keep the implementation in one place and still keep the provider if we wanted to. So Fabrizio, you got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I agree. If we keep it separated somehow, it gives an option, and this could be interesting. I'm not sure of how it is important, this option to use it as, let me say, standalone. What I'm sure now is that in order to keep it separated, basically you have to maintain a lot of scaffolding. The entire scaffolding that KubeBuilder puts on you, and also an entire report. That means a separate pro jobs, test signal, stuff like that. So there is a lot of work just to get, let me say, an empty provider up. Then we can share the code. This is something that we can use. But my humble opinion is that let's complicate things as soon as there is a clear need for.
Yeah, that sounds good. Vince, you got your hand up.
I was wondering, Mike, like, do you have like requirements to have a KubeMark as a library in different repo, or like if that becomes like a library within CapD, I guess, like would that be okay as well? Because I'm thinking like if right now, like I cannot think like of any other use apart from like within our testing, and maybe like someone else, like vendor in CapD downstream also wanted to use it for testing, but that would be consumable as part of the CAPI release.
Yeah, I mean, I personally don't have any hard requirements to have KubeMark as a separate provider the way it is currently. Like it kind of organically we ended up there. And yeah, what Nadir's saying, your volume's a little low, Vince.
Oh, sorry.
But so like I don't necessarily have a problem if we centralize the work in the CapD provider. In fact, I think that seems to be making the most sense. And if there ever arises a need to have the separate KubeMark provider on its own, then we could try to like, use some sort of packaging to get the library bits out of there. But yeah, like I don't necessarily think we need to keep it separate. And I think honestly it makes more sense for us to focus the work inside the cluster API repo in the CapD provider. I would just, if we decide to go that way, I would like to see us kind of archive the KubeMark providers so we don't so we don't create confusion in the community and whatnot.
I think that we needed to wait for SIG scalability feedback, because if they are actor in this story, this will be a huge win for both, but probably it will require something to accommodate their needs as well. So let's see what is their reaction to the proposal.
Yeah, that sounds good. No need to rush this. Like the changes I'm doing are just kind of like similar to what you're doing, Fabrizio. It's kind of like proof of concept, experimental type stuff. Okay, Vince, you still had your hand up. Did you have something else?
No, that's all. Thank you.
All right, cool. Are there any other opinions or objections to what we're talking about here with KubeMark? Okay, I'm not seeing any hands, so let's move on to the next topic. Fabrizio, you got this one. Take it away.
Okay, so I'm starting to work to some of the changes required in the 1 Alpha 4 for basically making cluster cattle move to support moving the new model of credential from one cluster to the other. And while taking a look at this code, basically I focused a little bit on the cluster cattle / move label that exists, and that basically allows you to mark one of your CRDs or one of your object in a way that cluster cattle will move no matter of the owner chain. So this feature is still important. What I kind of think is that it should not be a label, it should be an annotation. Because, and so basically I'm proposing, let's deprecate the label and introduce an annotation with the same name.
Vince, go ahead.
So the labels though are indexable and we could query on labels like through the client. I'm wondering if like we wanna, like if there is any downside here, because like you can't just like query all the objects with a specific annotation, but you could do that with labels. Otherwise you have to go one by one, which is probably not useful.
Yeah, this is a good point. To be honest, I don't have in mind a use case where you want to search for this CRD or for this, but yeah, I'm fine with either one, or because now a little bit of more cost. Now I have to introduce a new label / annotation to allow basically to move not only the single object, but the object and its entire hierarchy. For instance, an identity with the secrets that is linked to the identity. And so given that I have to add a new one, I want to make them consistent and that's it. So either both label or either both annotation. I'm fine with whatever we decide.
Just a question maybe for Vince or for clarification here. Like, are we currently using any filters around those labels?
I don't know, Fabrizio, like you probably can answer that more than me.
I'm not aware of it. This is why I proposed the change. But if we are fine to keep the label, is not a big problem for me. So I will just add another label. That's it.
Okay, cool. I was just curious. Yassine, go ahead.
Yeah, one of the things that I like about the label is that you can query through the CLI to group things to see what is actually going to get moved forcefully or not.
That's
Okay.
a good UX point, yeah.
That's fair. So I will not deprecate and I will add a new label. Thank you very much for answering.
Just to clarify, the label is on the CRD, right? Object.
The label could be applied both at the CRD object. For instance, I want to move all the IPAM claims object, or it can be applied on a specific object. So I want to move only this secret. And for instance, we are using this to move the cloud config secret. So
Okay.
the label can be at both levels, CRD or object.
So, and I assume if it's the CRD level, we move all the objects for that CRD. So when we query the CRDs, like we could use that label to filter on those results, so that we just return a smaller list. But for the objects, like, are we just gonna scan all the objects in the cluster, or like just a prefix set of objects?
We currently in Cluster Cattle, we are not. We are already scanning a set of objects, and that means that is we are not doing a separate operation, a separate list with a label selector. Mm-hmm. So it is having a label is not a requirement for Cluster Cattle, given that it is already reading the object due to other reasons.
Okay. That works. But if I apply that label on a pod, that pod wouldn't get moved, right? Like that would be, okay, perfect.
So it sounds like we have some consensus around keeping the labels. Any other comments or questions about this topic? Okay, I'm not seeing any hands, so let's move on to the next topic. Nadir, that's you.
Yeah, so a couple of weeks ago, we decided to try and formalize some of the guidance around not controller multi-tenancy, but for provider multi-tenancy contracts around for Azure being able to provision into different subscriptions, but AWS being able to provision into different AWS accounts, and for vSphere connecting to different vCenters. I've got two main questions I want answered before I go further with that guidance. I'll go with the easier one first. So there is this doc that explains more about what the use cases are if you're not familiar with that. The first one, it was a question from David Justice around how label selectors work. So for instance, the AWS provider uses the sort of default label selector mechanism, which is if the label selector, well, Sadef can probably correct me, but if I get it the right way around, is if the label selector is nil, it applies to everything. And if the label selector is empty, then it applies to nothing. And there was a question, it's like, well, that's kind of, it's not very explicit for the end user. Now, this is a normal Kubernetes construct, but do we want a more explicit behavior? I've got a suggestion from the new Gateway API. They do have an explicit field for this now. So maybe we want to do that. So that's one question. And then the second question is, so in the guidance, we say for cluster scope resources, if you're referencing, say, a secret in that CR. So for I'll give the AWS example is pretty easiest. Well, that all I know well enough is there's a cluster static principle that references the AWS access key and secret access key. you can't specify the namespace as a source, so the controller will only read that secret from the same namespace in which the controller was running. Now, some people might, and we're not going to, we said we're not going to support this in the cluster cutoff operator for V1 Alpha 4, but some people might still use separate instances of the controller per namespace that have deployed multiple instances, and then they might end up referencing the same cluster scope resources, and then which secret being read is kind of weird. So there's basically two options. Well, there's a bunch of options basically, and I haven't really, I'm fairly agnostic around them. I think I'm more convinced around maybe making an explicit behavior for label selectors and less about other things. And there's some hands as well, so I'll stop there.
Yeah, we got a couple hands, and Vince added a comment in chat as well. So Yassine, go ahead.
Yeah, so for cluster scope referencing secrets in different namespaces, so I guess the fact that you're able to create such resources is in itself a highly privileged operation. So I guess that if you have the right RBACs, this means that you are pretty much a trusted user of that cluster. So referencing a secret within another namespace might be a legitimate use case for you.
Thanks for that.
Gab, you had your hand up as well.
Yeah, I just got a clarifying question around running multiple instances. At least from the docs, I don't know if it's outdated, but it said that's a way to basically support multiple credentials before multi-tenancy is properly supported. I'm wondering if there are any other use cases, or if multi-tenancy is properly implemented across providers, if we still need to have the ability to run multiple controller pods.
I'll just reply to that one. I think the main one that I had was around scalability, maybe that you might want multiple instance resources. You might want a higher level of isolation just to make sure. I know Red Hat had that concern. I'll leave that to others about how they feel about that. So,
Vince, you had your hand up.
If anybody were to answer this specific question, because I don't have an answer to that, but I have answered to other things.
Okay. Did anyone have an answer to Gab's question before we go further here? Fabrizio?
So with regards to the idea of running multiple instances of the same provider, which this is the question, Gabriel. Exactly. So basically, we tried this in the past, and we ran into some problem, mostly because when you think to a provider and the entire set of things that build up a provider, some of them are namespaced, but some of them are global. And more specifically, the webhook are global. So that means that even if you install more copy of the, let me say, the controller, all of them have to share the same webhook and the same CRD definition. This becomes kind of weird and complex as soon as basically your instance of the provider start getting different versions. And this is why in the move basically one of the big themes of V1 Alpha 4 is to remove the possibility to have multiple instances of provider and instead support a different way of express multi-tenancy, because let me say original multi-instances was a workaround for solving multi-tenancy. Now we can solve multi-tenancy in a proper way, and so basically we are trying to avoid complexity in the deployment. Does this make sense or answer this question?
if I can add to that, like the web code validation, defaulting, and conversion is used and considered as part of the controller code. So before an object actually gets reconciled, for example, like in some places, like we don't do nil validation because we default it in the webhook code, right? And I mean, that's expected because that code is part of the chain. So if you have a batch version that does that and the old version doesn't, like you get into issues. And yeah, so like these webhooks are global, so that's what you mentioned. I wanted to touch base on the label selector. So far we have never allowed, or actually it was allowed and then disallowed, then a label selector would match everything. And this goes against like Kubernetes, but we don't have to follow all the conventions that they use for some reasons. So I'm wondering, like, is there like a 100%, like, do we want to do this 100%? Because you could label like things if they have to get a default credentials. Like you could just say like, hey, this labels for my default credentials and apply them to all the namespaces, I guess, like you would want to get the label into.
So concretely for AWS, we did it for the cluster controller principle, which is a singleton CR, and is to allow the upgrade path. So if you've already got a load of AWS clusters, they're already using a set of credentials. So you want a seamless upgrade. We need something that can default to all namespaces, and we have a flag in the controller that automatically creates that resource with a defaulting to allowing for all namespaces. I think what I'm hearing though, since we don't like that behavior in cluster API, that maybe we should go for the more explicit option that the gateway API has opted for, which is there is a from field, which is an enumeration. And so the gateway class, there's a whole bunch of differences with the way gateway API works, because they have a many-to-many relationship between gateways, which are load balancers, and HTTP routes, which is not quite the same use case. So all of those resources are namespace scoped, and then they have a from field or in the allowed namespaces equivalent that we copied, that you can select same namespace, all namespaces, or selector. So I guess if we're sticking with the cluster scope resource, we would have like a allowed namespaces from an enumeration of either selector or all, and then that would make the sort of defaulting behavior explicit.
Okay. Given that you have that option, like, couldn't you just sort of pre-apply that label like to all the resources?
Yeah, that's right. So we could then put other defaulting that would set that explicitly. But so basically we definitely move away from the standard Kubernetes core behavior in favor of something that's has a bit more explicit and not reliant on you knowing the difference between nothing and open bracket, close bracket in a YAML file.
Yeah, like the closest example I can think of is actually the machine set. Like if you don't have any selectors, like we add like our own like set of default selectors. This is to make sure that like we don't adopt like some other machines that like it should not be adopted. But yeah, I'm like also +1 to be super explicit on that.
Okay, thanks for that. So I think that's question one resolved. Two, we've discussed that the badness around having the multiple instances. Do we definitely do we want to allow you to select a secret from any namespace in a cluster scope resource then, given that it is generally a super privilege? Vince is shaking his head saying no. Or do we just document that this is basically how it's going to work and you're on your own if you deploy multiple instances?
So I see Fabrizio and Vince's hand up. I don't know who was up first, though.
Vince.
Go ahead, Vince.
So generally, like crossing the namespace boundaries is like a big no-no. So I would keep that. like for the deploying multiple controllers, like as we have mentioned, like that would be an unsupported path. And we kind of agree that, like, you know, if we want to go in that direction, we need to make changes like throughout the code bases, and there needs to be a proposal that like actually spans across controllers, solves the webhook question, and like how do we deal with CRTs. So I'm inclined to just, you know, put that boundary in place here because we already decided on that bit, and like, yeah, we shouldn't like do cross namespaces, pulling up secrets especially.
All right, Fabrizio.
Yeah, adding on top of that, if we are allowing to basically have a secret in any namespace, that means that when we implement cluster cut-all move, we have to read from all the namespace, which is not nice. So now the solution that we discussed is that we read only from the namespace that we are moving and from the provider namespace, which is something that we already have asked. So is kind of better scoped to the cluster API word inside a cluster instead of all around the cluster. So I'm definitely +1 to keep this scoped.
So
Cool. That answers it for me then. Thanks, everyone.
cool. Yeah, I was going to say it sounds like we got some answers to your questions, and I guess in terms of the multiple instances of providers, it sounds like the next step, if we want to keep pursuing that, is to create an enhancement and really have the discussion there about the details and everything. Okay, well, there are no more topics on the agenda, and no one has added anything. Are there any kind of last minute questions or comments or concerns people want to bring up, or should we end the meeting? All right, I am not seeing any hands going up or more text being added to the meeting notes. So let's take 25 minutes of our day back. Thank you all for coming out, and should have the recording up shortly.
Thank you for hosting, Mike.